Welcome to this week's episode of the Red Couch Podcast. Alongside me always is my co-host Allan, and our guest today is Chris Hanna, who is part of the Fanshawe Indigenous Strategic Learning Center. Right? Is that correct?
I'm part of the Institute of Indigenous Learning.
Okay.
And my job title is I'm the Indigenous Strategic Learning Guide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, in recent years, the atrocities of the treatment of natives has tainted the overall image of Indigenous culture and history in the country. And when many Canadians are asked about what they think about Indigenous culture and history, they tend to think about stuff like that when it comes to their minds. And they tend to forget about the numerous beautiful and rich cultures of Canada's native people. So, according to the City of London, we are on the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Lenape. Is that correct?
Close. Yeah. So it's the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples. Yeah.
Okay. And to dive into Native culture, you as well come from an Indigenous background, right?
Yeah. So I'm Métis. I'm from Drummond Island and Penetanguishene. Drummond Island is right next to Manitoulin. And so it was part of Canada at one point. It's now part of Michigan. And so there was a large Métis community that lived there. And then when borders changed after the War of 1812, the Canadians, well, I guess the British that the Métis were fighting with were like, oh, we don't want them, so the Americans can have that island. So then all of the Métis community there got displaced, and my family and lots of Métis from that region ended up in Penetanguishene. So that's why I say I'm from both. But that's my community. Yeah. So I'm not local, but I'm Ontario, Michigan, Métis. Yeah.
Wow. You actually know already so much about that. How did you actually come to learn a lot about that?
Yeah. So I think like in our communities, it's really important to be able to say who you are and where you're from. And so often if you're meeting an Indigenous person in Canada and well, I mean, certainly between ourselves, we'll say, okay, well, where are you from? And it might be, oh, I'm from Kettle Point, which is a local nation, or, oh, I'm from Oneida or Six Nations. And so it's important for us to say who we are, because where we're from is part of who we are. And so that's something that's often passed down. Sometimes you'll say like who your family is too. So like I'm from the Dusom and Longlad families, which are Métis from those regions. And so that helps me connect to who my cousins are. So that's all part of an introduction. But then there are also folks who, like you were talking about some of the historical impacts of colonization in Canada, who might not be able to say where they're from because of whether it's 60 Scoop or residential schools or being part of Children's Aid Society. And so there's also lots of reasons why some Indigenous people might not be able to do that. But for me, because I'm fortunate to be able to know from my mom, who's Indigenous and has been able to pass all of that down from my grandpa and that side of the family. Yeah.
Oh, it's actually nice and like having family that will actually still keep some of that's going on. Like I know I come from Scotland, so yeah, like my grandmother, she always kind of keeping some sort of tradition going on. It's these steak pies that she always likes to keep bringing on. But it was still interesting actually getting to learn, and I love taking time just to sit and learn some of like the background from like my grandmother. Did you actually grow up actually learning some of this?
So yes and no. So in my family, so like, okay, I was born in the 90s, and back then what we always said and what we were always taught was, oh, we're part Indian. That was kind of the terminology that we used at that time. And so I always knew that from my family growing up, but I didn't really know the term Métis. I didn't really know what that all meant or get too deep into my culture outside of knowing that, like, I don't know, when my brother ran track and field, like they like made moccasins for him to run in, because they were like lighter, like, so there were some little bits and pieces of that. But my mom really got involved in community when I was in high school, actually. when I was about 16. And so I started to learn a little bit more then. And then I learned a lot actually when I went to post-secondary school. which is a time where like lots of Indigenous people, if you didn't grow up in it, will start to learn. It's like, for everyone, it's like a time of like learning and growing and figuring out about yourself. But for Indigenous people that didn't grow up in the culture or didn't grow up in that knowledge, it's a really cool opportunity to meet other Indigenous people and like, I don't know, even take a class, So that's really when I started coming into it. And then, I don't know, I've been working with Indigenous communities now for probably 12 to 15 years now. And so that's where a lot of my learning has come from, was just from sitting with other Indigenous people and from, knowledge keepers. And I also married into another Indigenous family. My husband is Métis from Red River, and so I also get to take all of his learnings from his family as well and kind of incorporate that into the way that I see the world. So yeah, that's how I kind of came into it. Different story for everyone.
It's interesting though, like how you actually expanded a bit more of your knowledge and some of like the horizons on that side, and just people that you were around. Is that some of the things that you saw, how it kind of benefited to get towards your work experience?
Yeah, so like I feel like in Indigenous traditions, we learn from each other. That's really the only, like from like an Indigenous perspective, knowledge is shared and it comes in relationship. And so whether that relationship is with each other, or even like the reason that we tend to look to the natural world a lot is because in most Indigenous traditions, when you're looking at a creation story, humans were created last. And so that means that we're still trying to figure it all out, but everything else that was created before us already knows what they're supposed to be doing. So that's why we would look to like, a beaver and like take lessons, because beaver already knows what he's doing. And so we can apply those things into our life. You can do that with plants. You can do that with lots of, the idea is that everything else already knows what they're doing, and us as humans are still trying to figure it out. So knowledge comes in relationship. And I think Western society tends to view that more as like especially in certain like lecture style courses, right? You might feel like you have to go and like kind of learn the content on your own. But really, the knowledge that you're getting, whether it's from a textbook or from your teacher, you are still learning in relationship. It just might look a little bit different. But we tend to really highly value that in our communities. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, it's actually interesting to see that, like looking outside of just like our own perspectives and seeing the nature around us, especially when you were saying about the beavers. And
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like, would it be almost like a side as well, like learning from them too?
Yeah. So like I'm going to talk about beaver because I was talking about beaver in another context this morning. But so there's an Anishinaabe concept called the 7 grandfather teachings. And so there's things in there, stories about like honesty and kindness, and one of them is wisdom, and there's an animal that represents each of these, and beaver represents wisdom. And so beaver is, and I'm going to share like my understanding of this story, but you might hear from other Indigenous people and it might sound different and it might look different, but this is my understanding of it. So when I look at beaver uses his skills, right? The big teeth and the tail and everything, uses his skills, his talents in a sustainable way for the benefit of others. And so if you're going to apply that to like wisdom and what we can learn from that, how do we use our talents, our skills, what we have, how do we use that sustainably in a way that's going to carry on into the future, into future generations for the benefit of others? So that's the way that I would apply that. Lots of people are going to apply that differently in different communities, but that's like my understanding of it. So yeah, that's just an example of how you might take something from nature and kind of apply it to yourself. But it's the idea that beaver already knows what he's doing, and so we can learn lots of things from beaver and from lots of creation all around us. Coming out here swinging with the big ones.
And kind of rewriting back to like Fanshawe, how did you end up here at Fanshawe?
Yeah. So I got a job when I was so I went to Western, went to school at Western. I graduated in 2009, which was like not the best time to be graduating from school, right? Recession. You guys know because you're about to do the same thing. So struggled to find work for a little bit, and then got a job working for an not-for-profit called Skills Ontario. Fanshop partners with them it's around skilled trades, and so we're participants in competitions and things like that. And there was an Indigenous team because Indigenous peoples in Canada are more likely to go into trades and apprenticeships. And so it was my job to kind of travel to different communities and talk about how you actually get into the trades and what that looks like. And so I made a connection with it used to be called the First Nations Center here on campus. I made a connection here with the manager, and then when a job came up for the student success advisor position, then I was fortunate that I knew about it, and I applied and was hired. And then the role changed to the academic advisor, and so I did that for about 7.5 years, and then now I'm doing this role. So I like run professional development for people at the college, people that work at the college, whether you're like staff, faculty, administrators, whatever, about how to make the college a better place for Indigenous students. And then I also help develop like learning resources, so helping people make like right now I'm working on an Indigenous culinary module to talk about Indigenous foods for like the culinary program. So they're gonna actually make, some local First Nations dishes and things like that, but then take some of the learning around different foods and stuff. So that's how I got here and like what I do now.
I find that kind of interesting that that the college is now going to be incorporating Indigenous cuisine. What kind of foods would we kind of see in that?
Yeah, so I was just having a meeting about it this week. And so I think they're going to be learning how to do corn soup. So locally, the Haudenosaunee people were farmers, and corn was a big staple. And so lots of the foods that are like more traditional have corn in them, but it's not like the yellow corn that we would see. The closest thing that folks might heard of, it's called white corn, but if you're from like Latin America, like hominy corn is very similar. And so corn soup will be a big one. It's like white corn, which is grown specially locally with kidney beans and like salt pork, and it's like a soup. But then I think we're also going to be doing strawberry drink. So anyone who's Indigenous who is hearing this, you know what that is, because it's like a staple. Everybody, if there's any kind of like Native gathering, there's going to be strawberry drink there. And it's strawberry season right now, so it's pretty exciting. And then there's going to be a succotash that they were talking about doing, but also incorporating things like wild rice and, local fish like perch. I think there's lots of like Indigenous foods that are here that we just kind of think of as North American, but we've been eating them for, ever. So there are our local foods, and so it's kind of fun to introduce some of our local dishes. Yeah.
It's quite interesting. I can't wait. I'm going to dive into that myself if I get a chance to.
Yeah.
Cool. And kind of extending on into the other factor, that it is June, and June is known as Indigenous History Month. I kind of want to dive into the origins of how this month came to be, especially for the Indigenous people and its meaning to them.
Yeah, so honestly, I'm not very well versed in how the month came to be. I will say that it is like it's an opportunity for non-Indigenous people to learn. That's kind of the way that I think most of us perceive it. And so what it means for us is that often we get quite busy during this month with people requesting for us to come in and talk and share our stories. And so part of that is like, I don't know, opening your minds to like what Indigenous people in Canada have experienced. And that likely looks very, very different from what you or your family have experienced if you are not Indigenous. And so I think it's a good opportunity for folks to reflect on like, when did your family come to Canada, or when did you come to Canada? Whether that was like 2 months ago or like maybe 300-400 years ago. Like the white side of my family has been here since Jacques Cartier. So like a long, long time. So on one side, I'm like very heavy settler family, been here for a long time. And then on the other side, it's Indigenous, right? So it's important to think about like when your family came to Canada, why was that? Was that for more opportunities? Was it escaping, religious persecution? Was it fleeing World War II? Was it to come here for school? Why did you come here? What did that look like for your family? What opportunities did they have? What opportunities do you have? And at the same time, what was going on for Indigenous peoples during that time period? I think that's really important to think about, right? So, if you were coming here after or like during or right before World War II, what was happening for Indigenous peoples at that time? I mean, you were deep into residential schools at that point. Or if not residential schools, then day schools. And if you've never heard of a day school, like Google it. It's really interesting and a really important part of Canadian history that isn't talked about too much. At that point in time, it was like often illegal for First Nations people to use like mechanical farming equipment. It was illegal for us to attend post-secondary school. So there are all of these things, right, where people may have come here for opportunities and access them and now have wonderful full lives and generations of access to these things. But it wasn't the same for First Nations and Métis and Inuit people here during that same time period. And even now, right, there are still disparities that exist in Canada. And so with it being Indigenous History Month, I'd encourage everyone to kind of do that reflection. And if you're a recent immigrant to Canada, it's also important to think about what is still going on, and really important for everyone that's here at this point. There are still disparities in Canada that exist for Indigenous people.
Right. And so I wanted to bring up about that is the education factor. It's a good month for everyone to educate themselves on Indigenous history. I can say even Alex, we were talking about this a bit yesterday. We were saying during growing up, especially in our elementary school years, we never really talked about Indigenous history or culture. And now I was going to say, should we infuse Indigenous history into early education, and how could we see that as playing a role in reconciliation after what we've recently come across in Canadian history?
Yeah, I think that would be good, because I think it's sometimes people worry about teaching young children about the history, and I can understand that to some extent. But I don't think it's too early to start introducing the idea that there are other people here that maybe maybe you don't know, but there are other people here that live differently and that experience different things. There are ways to talk about things that are helpful and good learning opportunities for even very young children. And so I do think it's really important. I know when I went through school, mind you, this was in Ohio, but the sense that I got from going through elementary school and talking about, Native Americans down in the States was that there weren't any left. That like me and my family were the most like Native people left. And that was really kind of shocking and a bit devastating. And then, I get older and I meet other people and I'm like, oh, well, that wasn't true. But that was the sense that I got going through the elementary school system. And so that's really detrimental to only talk about Indigenous people as a historical people, because we are contemporary. I mean, we're still here. We're at the college. There's lots of students here. There are staff. There are faculty that are Indigenous here, right? There's administrators. And so I think it's important to also learn that we are also a contemporary people and that you might run into us. In fact, we're like 1 in 5 Canadians. So if you know like 20 people, like, you know us. Yeah.
It's interesting because I know when I was younger, and I mean, I'm a first generation Canadian on my dad's side because he came here from Scotland. So I know growing up through school, like Canada was always new to me, and I always wanted to like learn more about what was going on here in Canada because I felt like it was sort of something I should be doing. And I remember going to this one event because I live out in Kitchener area,
Yeah.
and when I was younger, we went to this one event, and when I was young, I had no clue what it was. I was like, what is this? And growing up, then I started to recall that like event. I was like, oh, this was actually something for us kids to learn about, like Indigenous history. But at the time, we never really got taught much about it. It was a field trip. We were going on a field trip, and I'm so unsure of like why, like, are we actually not getting more educated about this? Like, what else should we be actually adding in
Yeah.
this school system?
Well, I think honestly at this point, I think in the past there was some malice and some racism. I think at this point it's a lot of fear, right? People are scared about not saying the right things. People are scared to talk about things that they don't know everything about. But the thing is, as non-Indigenous people, you're never going to know everything about us. I don't know everything about us because I'm just one person, you know? And so I think fear gets in the way a lot of having conversations around why are you going to a powwow for a field trip? You know, why are we wearing orange shirt days? Or why are we wearing orange shirts on September 30th, right? So there's like this, the easy things that you can do without any of the context. And I think that's really unfortunate. But, you know, have the conversation. That's what should be happening in elementary schools. Have the conversation. Why does it matter that we're talking about this?
I gotta say, on my own time, elementary school, even high school as well, I'm a huge history buff, and I took a lot of interest to, like, as we mentioned before, the War of 1812, even the Red River Rebellion, for instance, and
We call it the resistance.
the resistance.
The
My
Red
bad.
River Resistance.
I
No,
was
it's
about to
okay.
say.
That's a really good like point though too, right? The way that things are framed in history is very different depending on what community you're from. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's the interesting thing is, and that's one person I want to kind of talk on is the Red River Resistance was the main figure was Louis Riel, and learning about it in high school, they didn't talk about him in a positive light. And coming from a Greek background, we had people who were like Louis Riel, and they fought for kind of like the same image, but they paint them as heroes, and they painted Louis Riel as a menace to Canadians at that time, which I found kind of awkward in that sense. And everyone else just like they kind of just let it pass on by them. And I think it's kind of important that we kind of change the way people have seen him or people like him through history and kind of paint them in a better light, if that makes sense.
Totally. Well, and Louis Riel was, when you look at it, really was a founding father of Canada.
Yes.
Because he signed the agreement that brought Manitoba into Canada as part of the nation. And that was the very first treaty that ever happened with Métis peoples. My husband is from Red River, right? He's from that community.
Right.
And so Louis Riel, for us, is a hero. And really, I think he probably should be for lots of Canadians. But, you know, he was French speaking and he was, you know, Catholic-ish. You know, Métis have a lot of additions to Catholicism to make it, you know, a little bit more Indigenous. And he was brown, right? And so all of those things combined doesn't, I think Quebec has a different version of Louis Riel than English-speaking Canada does, especially Ontario. And so I think that's, yeah, it's interesting. He's a very important historical figure in Canadian history that is often kind of maligned because of who he was. Yeah.
And to touch on to the topic of Métis culture as well, in high school we kind of did talk about in world religions. We did talk about Indigenous culture, certain ceremonies and ritual. I don't want to call them. Is it appropriate to call them rituals?
Yeah.
Rituals, but also dances as well. What are some things that you have seen that is celebrating the Métis culture?
Yeah. So, you know, First Nations are really heavily associated with drums. We use drums as well, but we also use fiddles. So there's like for us, there's certain like fiddlers and fiddle music and different dances that we would do. You know, we have like Louis Riel is perhaps a pipe carrier. Gabriel Dumont, one of his accomplices, you know, also a pipe carrier, right? And so there are lots of shared traditions that we have with First Nations, but there are some of our own pieces as well. So we would still go do sweats, we would still go do Sundance ceremony, but there are some pieces, we pray a little bit differently, and, you know, like lots of different Indigenous cultures, but ours tend to be a little bit more, like, depending on who you're talking to, perhaps a little bit more Christian, but not always. So it just depends.
It seems so nice. So, like, especially when you're talking about the fiddles, like, it just seems like something so nice and elegant. I mean, I know from Scotland, we just have the obnoxious bagpipes wherever you go.
Yeah, it's interesting because even with Greek culture, like I've seen videos, and I've been to I think I've been to 1 or 2 powwows in my time in elementary school because I was so enamored by Indigenous culture. Certain dances, like the same, like because Greek culture as well, they have certain dances that have significant meanings behind them. It's kind of cool to see that traditions they've carried on with so many different cultures, and that was really cool to see over here in Canada as well.
Yeah, it's cool. It's nice to see, I don't know, the way that different people do things. Yeah.
Absorbing different cultures as well. It's just cool.
Yeah.
I mean, education, like, is educating everyone about this is like such a key part. And I mean, even in the elementary side, like it's good to have those discussions, but like, how do we actually keep going further with it? I mean, you're here at Fanshawe. What is sort of the main focus for you when you're here?
So, I mean, in my role, my main focus is improving student outcomes, right? So, and Indigenous student outcomes, right? So, right now there are graduation gaps between First Nation, Métis, Inuit students and other domestic students. And in theory, right, they should have had the same opportunities. So why are they not successful here? We tend to look at that as a system problem. It's not a problem like inherent within us, right? It's a problem with the way that we interact with the system as it exists now. So how can we adjust the system to make it more inclusive and more welcoming to Indigenous students? And we tend to, I feel very strongly that what we do to support Indigenous students is likely going to have a ripple benefit effect for lots of other students as well. Things like flexibility and, you know, allowing students to kind of move through more at their own pace. So that's kind of what I would like to see at the college. But I think from like a education and from a person-to-person basis, I think it would be really nice for people to take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and there are a bunch of recommendations on what you can do to move towards reconciliation, some that are very personal and some that are for the media. So for all of you guys in the room, that's a really good place to start for you. But see what's in there and see how you can apply that to actually improve things. I think learning is really important, but like I said earlier, you're never going to have all of the right answers to make a difference. It's important to just try anyways. So just start doing something, and that can be a good place to find out maybe what you could do.
And for our viewers who are watching right now, if they want to get involved in the community and educate themselves this month, or even just any time of the year about Indigenous culture, do you know of any places in the community that are good places to kind of look or start from?
Yeah, so there are some organizations in this city that are like open to non-Indigenous people coming. At LOSA has some events that you could participate in. But I would also say, like, you know, go to the internet. These are all on your phones all the time anyways, you know. The Institute of Indigenous Learning has like a very thorough YouTube channel, and you can learn all sorts of things on there. It's things from, you can listen to knowledge keepers, you can learn about what smudging is, you can hear from Indigenous students, you can hear what it means to different people to actually be Indigenous. And so I think it's really important that what you're doing is hearing from authentic Indigenous voices as you're going and doing your learning.
Interesting. Well, it's been quite an interesting conversation we've had here. Thank you for coming in and talking with us.
Of course.
That has been this week's episode of the Red Couch Podcast. You can find us online at YouTube and Twitter, and also subscribe to our newsletter. I'm Konstantinos Drossos, alongside my host, Allan. Thank you very much for watching.